Good afternoon and welcome to this important webinar, which is being recorded or to discuss the important events of the past couple of weeks in the Republic of Korea. Stunning events, shifts in policy and politics that have seen the impeachment of the sitting president, massive protests throughout the country, and of course a period of intense instability. We're delighted to be able to host this webinar with two leading experts who I will introduce in just one second. But let me just say this. The Pacific Council on International Policy has decided that 2025 would be a year of focus on South Korea, and in particular on California-Korea relations. A few weeks ago, we began our Korea working group, which is pulling together experts from California, Korea, and beyond to talk about the relationship between the United States and Korea, but more importantly, the California and Korea. And we will be leading a delegation of experts from California to Korea in May of 2025. So the timing of political events in Korea over the past couple of weeks has obviously made our work seem more prescient and timely. I think that it wasn't any insight or foresight on my part. It was really just dumb luck in terms of being just choosing the right country of focus. But it has shown the importance once again for folks in California and throughout the United States to keep a keen eye focused on what's happening in our strategic partners around the Pacific Rim. Introductions. Let me first introduce a former colleague of mine from the Wilson Center, Jean Lee. Jean Lee is a journalist and foreign policy analyst, renowned for her expertise in covering North Korea and Northeast Asian affairs. She is the co-host of the award-winning Lazarus Heist podcast, which I can recommend very, very highly. I've enjoyed that enormously, Jean. And that's for the BBC World Service. And she is a former Pyongyang bureau chief for the Associated Press news agency. She's been reporting on the ground in North Korea since 2008, and in 2011 became the first American journalist to join the Pyongyang Foreign Press Corps in North Korea. She has been the director of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, Hyundai Motor Korea Foundation Center for Korean History and Public Policy, where she led very, very important research and programming on relations between the United States and the Republic of Korea and North Korea. In 2023, she joined the East-West Center as a POSCO visiting fellow, and is now an adjunct fellow with the EWC and a non-resident fellow at the European Center for North Korean Studies at the University of Vienna. There are many, many other things I can say about Jean Lee, but one of the things I do want to point out is that she's a member of the Pacific Council on International Policy, and we're very, very grateful for you being a member of our organization, Jean, and to count with your expertise that we can call upon at a time like this. And for any of you who would like to know more about Jean's work, please go to her website, www.jhleemedia.com. Let me also introduce Professor Cho Hee-Yoon, who is on the ground in the Republic of Korea. We are delighted to have you, Professor Cho, with us today. Professor Cho currently teaches law at Hongik University in Seoul, South Korea. She formerly served as a deputy head of government affairs and senior counsel at Reuters Limited. She's worked in legal and government affairs capacity in various places in Australasia and in Europe. She has been admitted to the bar in England and Wales. I assume you mean the legal bar, not just a pub. And bad joke on my part. In England and Wales, Australia, and New York State. She writes a monthly column for the Korea Times, appears regularly on radio and TV current affairs programs as a commentator, studied law in Australia and in Korea, and international relations in England. So welcome, Professor Cho. Thank you so much for being with us today. Let's jump straight into the conversation, and I'm going to come to you, Professor. I wonder if you could please explain to our audience what has happened in Korea over the past couple of weeks, what it means for democratic resilience, and what do you expect will happen next? And I know that's a very, very big package of questions right there. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the role of civil society in the protests, because when we talk about ground truth, you were literally there on the ground in Seoul when much of these events were unfolding. I'd like to also hear your opinion on the role of the media's coverage of the crisis, and to ask you, is there really any precedent for this kind of political turmoil in recent Korean history? Over to you, Professor.
So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is a shorthand way of referring to what happened on that 3rd of December when Yoon Suk-yeol, currently president in limbo, awaiting impeachment trial before the Constitutional Court, made a declaration of emergency martial law. So 1, 2 in December, 3, the 3rd. And he made this, he appeared on television around 10:27 p.m. At night, on the Tuesday night. And after delivering a short statement, some ramblings about how the opposition party is simply refusing to cooperate and how they are continually impeaching high-level public officials, and that there are, and then started making accusations about how there is like infiltration of North Korean forces within the National Assembly. And then all of a sudden he says, I therefore declare an emergency martial law. So 4-5, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 4-5, because it's been 45 years since last time martial law was declared in Korea. Some people might argue it's 44, but I think most people consider the 1980s martial law to be a continuation or an extension of the one declared in 1979 after the assassination of Park Chung-hee. So 4-5. And 6 is the number of hours that this declaration of martial law lasted. So on that night, I actually didn't hear his statement live when he made it. I was actually working at my desk for an international conference that was due to take place that coming weekend, and busy writing. And all of a sudden, I heard some helicopter noises above head. My house is quite close to the National Assembly in Yeouido. And initially, I just dismissed it, thinking, oh, there must have been some accident and somebody's maybe being airlifted to the hospital. But looking back, I realized that deep down, I instinctively recognized that this set of helicopter noise was different to the ordinary emergency services helicopter noise. But anyway, I ignore it and keep working. Maybe another 20 or so minutes pass. And then I hear another set of helicopter noises and I'm thinking, what's going on? And then I get a call from my husband who was in a different city. And he tells me, Yoon has declared martial law. And my first reaction is, no way, you've got to be joking. That's just crazy. So I look up the news, and indeed he had made this declaration. And by that stage, the decree number 1 under martial law had also been released by the army general who was named as the commander of martial law. So I read both statements through. They're quite short. Didn't take even 5 minutes. And nothing was disclosed in the initial declaration by the president that would justify an emergency martial law under the Constitution. And the decree that was made under the this martial law declaration was in fact illegal. The very first paragraph banned all political activities by the lawmakers, members of the National Assembly, by political parties, and also assemblies, associations, gatherings, protests by anybody, the people in general. And there were just 6 paragraphs, not a very long decree. And number 5 basically said, I mean, there was things about how the control of media will now be sort of overseen by the martial law commander and the usual sort of provisions in the martial law decree. But number 5 was very interesting because it ordered all doctors back to their stations. You may not know that we've been having this medical crisis for the last 6 months or so in Korea because Yoon wanted to reform the medical services and he wanted to increase the quota for medical doctors, MD admissions in medical schools. And doctors were obviously very much against that, and they many of them have walked away from their jobs in university hospitals, etc., in protest. And so through this martial law decree, he was basically ordering back to their workplace. And the final paragraph, number 6, in that decree number 1, basically said that anybody who breaches this decree is a criminal and can be arrested without a warrant on the spot. And this was really devious because the Constitution provides additional protection to National Assembly members in times of martial law, because once a martial law is declared, the only organ that has the power to dissolve it or request the revocation of or lifting of the martial law is the National Assembly, the lawmakers. So because we have a unicameral system, not like in the U.S. where you have the Congress and the Senate, there is just one chamber of National Assembly. And so the Constitution says if the National Assembly votes to revoke the martial law, then the president has to forthwith, immediately accept that revocation and essentially, put an end to martial law. But paragraph 1 and paragraph 6 together basically made it illegal for a lawmaker to gather and to vote to resolve the martial law to be lifted. And so, I was just thinking, this has to be a joke. He's finally gone crazy. And I also saw calls by the opposition party leader and also the speaker of the National Assembly for citizens to come to the National Assembly. And I really had, this moment of struggle within myself. Do I go? Do I go? Because it was very scary, particularly the helicopter noises. And we all have very, sort of strong impressions of, although I didn't experience Gwangju myself, the way that civilians were treated during the martial law imposed in that city. And so I was debating for maybe 10 seconds, but then I thought, this is a time when even one more person on the street is going to be helpful. And so I decided to go, and you couldn't get a taxi. My car was somewhere else at the time. You couldn't get the buses won't stop. And so I just walked very fast. And all the time, helicopters were actually flying above. And that was really still very scary because during Gwangju Gwangju case, there were actually military helicopters that fired at civilians from the air. And by the time I got to the National Assembly building, there were already a wall of police buses in front, and also a row of military vehicles lined up, and soldiers in full combat gear with nighttime goggles and long rifles and all of that, their backpacks in groups surrounding the building, and also many citizens. While I was walking over, I also saw lots of cars driving towards the National Assembly direction, like a line of headlights, and also people riding share bikes that the city provides to get to the National Assembly building, as well as some what seemed like reporters and cameramen carrying their equipment. But I could feel that the atmosphere wasn't actually that belligerent or aggressive or scary. It was actually the citizens were more angry than the soldiers, and you had a sense that soldiers were really holding back. You could hear some citizens swearing at the soldiers. Most of them were telling them to, go home. You don't, this is not where you should be. Just leave peacefully. And they just kept repeating that. Other citizens were almost trying to kind of provoke the soldiers, going up very close to them, almost face to face, and swearing and so forth. But you could actually see the soldiers stepping back, and so they certainly weren't being belligerent, aggressive, etc. And after a little bit, I read the news. I had my phone with me that the National Assembly managed to pass the resolution to revoke the martial law, and I think the soldiers then pretty soon thereafter got orders to, retreat. And so they started getting on the buses and the military vehicles. And what the citizens then did was to basically go and stand in front of the door. And they were saying, we are not going to let you get out again. We are going to stay here until you leave. And then
So I'm curious, did you see lawmakers breaking into the National Assembly then? When you could you see that?
No.
How were
I
they
mean,
able to get?
thankfully, they had already got in there before I was able to get to the National Assembly. If there had been still, if they hadn't reached the quorum to make the vote, which is half of the members of National Assembly, 150, then they probably wouldn't have been able to take their vote that night. Mm-hmm. So I think that actually happened well before, because by the time I heard the helicopter noises and actually looked up the news, it was well past 11:30, and he had already made a declaration around 10:30. And I know that some citizens, as soon as they heard that news, just sprang to the National Assembly, and many of the lawmakers also just scrambled as quickly as possible to get to the National Assembly building. And it really afterwards really made me think about how this was all possible, because I thought, was it that apart from the martial law declaration power in the Constitution, there is actually a separate special legislation, Martial Law Act, which essentially sets out how the president can declare martial law, what has to happen procedurally for it to be valid, and who can revoke it, etc. And I was thinking, I wonder if in the past there was no power on the National Assembly to actually make this call to revoke the martial law. And I looked up the very first legislation, which was passed in 1949 under Syngman Rhee, and there was the power. It's just that in all other martial law cases, the National Assembly was never able to exercise it because they were already arrested and taken somewhere by the soldiers. And so one thought was Yoon so incompetent that he also managed to fail to achieve this properly? But that wasn't actually the case. We are getting much more and more information coming out now, but they had been planning this for a long time, and there are some really scary plans, some things that you think it could only come from some sort of political thriller or something, that just sounds more like a conspiracy theory than some plan that could come from the defense minister or the president. We don't know whether all of this is actually true. It hasn't been confirmed, verified yet, but they didn't, it wasn't that they failed for the lack of planning or resources. It was really the power of the citizens, and also the civic mindedness of the soldiers themselves, the lower ranking ones, certainly.
It really is an extraordinary privilege to have somebody who was, number one, there to witness all of this. Number two, who has training as a journalist and is able to, capture the moment in the way that you have. And thirdly, to have that legal training, who is able to understand the legal implications and the way that the Constitution works, as well as the political system. I mean, we truly feel privileged to have you here with us. I'd like to turn to.
That I'm not actually trained as a journalist. One of my former jobs was to look after journalists, but I never actually trained as a journalist.
You've spent enough time around them that you think like one as well. I can see. I want to turn to Jean now, and Jean, I know I could see your journalistic instincts coming out there. You wanted to jump in with a follow-up question, and please feel free at any point to do that. But I want to ask you, this is clearly something that's of enormous importance to the United States. Can you talk about the implications of the instability and the uncertainty, and put that in the context of the overall importance of the US-ROK relationship and how the United States government has reacted to the political crisis.
So before I talk about the foreign policy implications or the implications on the relationship, I do want to talk about what it was like. So I was in Honolulu and my phone started ringing at 4 a.m. And, you know, back when I was the AP bureau chief, so I was bureau chief in Seoul before I was the bureau chief in Kyoung, and I would get phone calls at 4 a.m. all the time from my desk in New York saying North Korea's done this or that, right? And I still remember my boss saying, keep your phone no more than 10 centimeters away from your ear. You know, in this case, I thought I'm no longer tethered to my phone. I'm just going to ignore these phone calls, but they just kept coming. When I saw the news alert from Yonhap news agency, the South Korean news agency, about martial law, I mean, my immediate reaction was, what is happening? Are we in a state of war? What has happened here? I think though that, of course, like everybody else, I got online and watched from a distance. It was very clear to me that this was, that North Korea is part of this issue, but that this was a political squabble. And hopefully, Professor Cho, we can talk about that a little bit. But the interesting thing for me as the day unfolded was how many people who are not in our world, people who don't live and breathe Korean affairs, just ordinary Americans were contacting me and weighing in and concerned and glued to the TV, because Americans today are so aware and so interested in everything that's happening in South Korea. And it's such a reversal than even 10 years ago or 15 years ago, or many, I'm not going to say how many decades, when I was, born and raised in the US, and people had no concept of South Korea, even though the United States had fought a war there. So what was so interesting to me was how knowledgeable and invested Americans were in what happens in South Korea. It also, I think, because right now people's awareness of South Korea is so much about the pop culture. It has just become such an economic and cultural powerhouse. And so for them, and they think of South Korea the way as a democracy, as a leading economy. And I think that this sense of upheaval was completely new to many Americans who see South Korea a certain way. But I would say, I've been trying to say in interviews that this is a reminder of what a young democracy South Korea is. I mean, I remember going to South Korea as a child when you did still see troops in the streets. I think this was a reminder that democracy is really only a generation old, right? And that these tendencies toward authoritarianism are still there. But what was so interesting to me was, and Professor Cho, as you were speaking, I was just thinking about the old Kimusa building. So there is a building that was well known. I remember we did a story when this building, which was known for where they carried out tortures and interrogations in Seoul, was turned into a museum. And I still do you remember the Kimusa building, right? And so in some ways, for me, turning that building into a museum was part of the closure, this recognition that South Korea had turned from a country of military dictatorships and authoritarianism into a place that could turn its history into something different and something positive, something where it was a place to create. But I was reminded of this thinking, it's not that long ago. And so it's a good reminder for us of South Korea's modern history. But I do think it was a political squabble. It is a political squabble at the core, and I hope we can talk about that. I think it is very concerning because not only has South Korea evolved and grown from being really one of the world's poorest countries at the time of the Korean War to one of the leading economies in the world, right? The fourth largest economy in Asia and among the top 10, 12 economies in the world. So important as well, not only economy, but in terms of geopolitics. Such an important partner to the United States at this time of strategic competition with China. And of course, at a time when things with North Korea are very tense and tenuous. And this is happening at a time of transition, when we go from one government, a Democratic government in the White House, to a Republican administration. So this is the time when, you know, the Biden administration surely wanted to shore up relationships and make sure that there's some continuity as there's a change of administration. And it makes it very difficult when you've got what looks like a power vacuum in a country that is really a linchpin, is very crucial to both economic and national security or regional security. So I think that there's a lot to think about, and there's a lot of concern in Washington about the impact that a protracted political crisis in South Korea could have, because it has been such a key partner for the United States, not only economically, but in terms of security and in this relationship with Japan, and also as a model for other countries in the region, other smaller countries that are trying to go from developing to developed like South Korea. So I do think there's a lot at stake here, and these are all reasons why we are watching this so closely. And the fact that you picked South Korea for 2025, I think reflects the growing importance and interest in South Korea. But all of this is happening at a time it serves as a reminder that democracy can be very fragile, it can be tested, and that there's a geopolitical issue, North Korea, at a time when North Korea is so closely working with Russia. So that's a conflict that has broader implications. So it is an interesting time for you to be focusing on Korea. It'll be South Korea. It'll be interesting to see how all of this unfolds.
Thank you, Jean. A quick follow-up question for you. How would you evaluate the reaction of the U.S. government? We've heard some criticism, of course, that the United States was too supportive of President Yoon in the period leading up to the crisis. Other people have said that the United States didn't necessarily, indicate its support for democracy strongly enough at the time. What's your take on that?
It was very clear from the early reactions from Washington that they were not aware that they were not briefed. And I think that anytime there's that break in communication, it's very concerning for Washington. And so I did see the first few remarks. I'm trying to remember exactly how Deputy Secretary of State Kurt Campbell stated it, but very critical, I think, of this action and very surprised, clearly. And in the wake of that, I think we've seen Washington make efforts to emphasize the ironclad strength of that relationship between the United States and South Korea, and really trying to emphasize the importance of democracy. So trying to convey and remind the leadership in Seoul to that they had a responsibility to uphold democracy. So I think that we're seeing a bit of an evolution of the reaction as more details come out. So, but as I said, it's such an awkward time. Now is both for South Korea and the United States. Now is the time, if you're Seoul, to be making an effort to connect with people in the Trump administration, the incoming administration, as well as to shore up policies at the working level with the Biden administration. And so it's a very awkward time for all of this to be happening. That said, I do hope that there has been enough work done at the working level among the trilateral countries, right? South Korea, Japan, and the United States, that there will be some stability and that these relationships will transcend and rise above any of the political instability in Seoul. But yeah, we're certainly seeing a flurry of activity in trying to shore up that relationship and make sure that the communication is smoother than it was clearly in the hours after that martial law decree.
Yeah, and one issue that has come up repeatedly in our discussions in the working group has been the importance of a more institutionalized relationship. In other words, making sure that the interagency links are there, that the institutional contacts between US government and Korean government, of course, but also the importance of track two diplomacy, civil society connections, and the fact that we can no longer expect government to do everything for us. It's very, very important to have this role of the media, of NGOs, etc., present there on the ground and with those contacts. Professor Cho, I'd like to come back to you. we're obviously hanging on your every word in terms of your account from those moments leading up to the declaration of law and then the repeal. But one thing that you pointed out in your first intervention was about the justification that President Yoon used, about North Korean interference, the challenge of insurrection to justify that declaration. Could you comment on that? And beyond that, the role that Pyongyang is playing today, how has Pyongyang reacted to the events south of the border? And of course, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too, Jean, after Professor Cho speaks. Professor Cho.
Right. So the declaration of emergency martial law didn't actually necessarily talk about infiltration of North Korea, but the influence of North Korea within the National Assembly and references to anti-state forces, which is always a kind of byword for North Korea here in South Korea. And so the president was essentially accusing National Assembly, particularly the opposition party, to be working with or taking orders from Pyongyang and essentially working against the interest of South Korean government. And we have absolutely no evidence of that. I mean, if anything, it's really the president who has refused to engage in politics. The politics is about making compromises, talking to the other side, trying to come up with solutions together. But he has point blank actually even refused to talk to the National Assembly. He didn't even attend the annual speech that he was supposed to give at the opening of the National Assembly in the last session. So it was all very strange because he was making all these accusations and trying to use that as justification for declaring martial law. And, although he failed the bar 8 times, he's still a lawyer and he's worked as a prosecutor all his life. He's even reached the height of prosecutor general. And so he must know that the grounds that he was citing was insufficient to actually validate an emergency martial law. And what we are now finding out is that pretty much for the last half a year or so, the defense minister, I believe, in cohorts with the president, I mean, he had to have reported to the president, has been making all these efforts to provoke North Korea into making some sort of attack on South Korea, and was intending to use that as an excuse to declare an emergency martial law. So there were 2 methods, or there were 2 approaches that they were trying to use. One was a direct provocation on North Korea. So we have some information that they sent unmanned drones to Pyongyang, but it was a faulty model that the military rejected as unsuitable for operational use because it was so noisy. And yet they sent it to North Korea and flew it at a much lower altitude than normal so that it would be, heard by everybody. And in fact, even the Russian ambassador to Pyongyang had reported that he could hear these drone noises. And I think North Korean basically shot them all down, but they didn't make any retaliation. The only retaliation they've been making are these excrement-filled balloons. So we here living in Seoul have been wondering, why is North Korea sending all these balloons all of a sudden? What have we done? Because they stopped those like really loud, loudspeaker broadcasts directed towards North Korea, and there was no real visible sort of causes for that kind of response or reaction. And we also noticed that the the statements that were being made by North Korea was becoming more and more stringent and more and more antagonistic towards Yoon administration. And I think this is around the time when they were making these stealthy, covert kind of efforts to try to provoke North Korea. The second method was actually to send South Korean soldiers or operators to Ukraine, because North Korean soldiers are now actually deployed in Ukraine and fighting alongside Russians, and somehow basically, either kill North Korean soldiers and thereby provoking North Korea once again to attack or respond in a belligerent way. But neither of those tactics worked. There was such a strong opposition in the National Assembly with regard to our government doing anything vis-a-vis Ukraine. I think there were maybe 12 special agents that have been sent, but we don't really know what they're doing. Anyway, and now with the November election, Trump will be the next president, and he has made it very clear that he intends to end the Ukrainian war very soon. And I believe one of his spokesperson actually said as much to South Korea. You stop any kind of engagement with Ukraine, we are warning you, that kind of thing. And so they realized that they can't really continue in that vein. And so that's why they sort of cobbled together these accusations about election tampering and the National Assembly being infiltrated by North Korean influences, and try to use this as justification. But I think once they have declared martial law, I think there were some follow-up operations that they were going to do to create more civil chaos, chaos within the society, to justify further additional measures that were going to be taken. So basically what they were trying to do is essentially dissolve the current National Assembly by accusing the last general election to have been tampered, and try to hold a new general election and vote in those people who will be much more supportive of Yoon. I think that's what they were trying to do. So as per usual, North Korea was once again being used as a bogeyman. Mm-hmm. And on the part of North Korea, they actually exploded 2 roads that lead to North Korea to ensure that South Korean troops won't be coming up to make any kind of invasion. And so we were also wondering, well, why didn't they respond in any other way? And I think they were just too preoccupied with their engagement in Ukraine, and they certainly didn't want to open up another front, obviously, in any way with South Korea. And they also didn't want to be a pawn in this, in this diabolical game that the Yoon administration seemed to have been planning. I mean, this all sounds like real conspiracy theory, and I still can't get my head around the fact that our own president and our defense minister were plotting something like this. And I'm a little bit, I should note that these are all allegations at the moment, but testimonies are coming out, information is coming out, and so it really can't be dismissed lightly.
As increasingly happens in global affairs, it sounds like a movie script that wouldn't be taken up by any major movie studio, but yet is real life. And so it's an extraordinary thing. Jean, I want to give you the opportunity to add in, your thoughts on North Korea, of course. But I'd also like to pick up on something that Professor Cho said about, the change of government here in the United States. So, could you comment, as we look ahead to the second Trump administration, can you talk about the road ahead for U.S. Korea relations? Is there any way in which this crisis has reminded folks in Washington how vitally important the relationship is? I mean, the thing that you said earlier on, which I think was fascinating, about how sort of, people who really have nothing to do with Korea are now aware of politics there and how important the country is. And what do we think we're going to see with regards to President Trump? Is he going to embrace the relationship with the Republic of Korea, or will we see a more disruptive approach? We had a visit recently from a leading think tank in Korea, and obviously, like everybody around the world, I mean, the most common question that we were asked was, how do we think that that President Trump is going to act in terms of the economic policy, tariffs, etc. How much importance will he place on Republic of Korea as a key ally? So your comments on that, but first of all, please, any comments you might have on North Korea.
Yeah, what I was going to say is, as I was watching events unfold, it felt to me like this was a president who was so frustrated. We felt very cornered. We should remember the political context, which is that he was working with a National Assembly that was dominated by the opposition. So this isn't by no means to defend him, but I was just trying to understand the psychology of somebody who would take this kind of action, which to me seemed like a very desperate kind of move, very authoritarian, desperate move. But I think if you look at the politics in South Korea, the domestic politics, it's so polarized. I mean, we have polarized politics in the United States as well. So I think there is a lot of overlap, and there's a lot to learn. It can serve as a warning. We saw something similar happen on January 6th of 2021. I was actually in Seoul then, watching it unfold on TV from a distance, just absolutely flabbergasted at what I was seeing happening on in Washington, D.C. But I would say that it's also important, and this might be interesting for your members, to understand that the partisan nature of how to think about North Korea and how that can impinge on politics, because South Koreans are very divided on how to look at North Korea. It is in some ways an existential question, right? How you think about North Korea, whether you choose, like the current government, to go an isolationist route, or whether you choose, like the previous government and the current opposition leader, to go the engagement route. These are very different ways of looking at how to live with North Korea. And so I think that it's important to remember that issue of, we can sometimes forget, when you're in Seoul, you can sometimes forget that this conflict is happening, because life goes on. Everyday life goes on in South Korea. It's so vibrant. Everyday life is not centered around North Korea, but it is always there. And I always try to tell young South Koreans that no matter what, their future is tethered to policymaking around North Korea. There's no way to completely divorce themselves from the issue of North Korea. And so this is an opportunity for us to understand, in a sense, how the North Korea issue can affect not only obviously the threat, right? And how the threat affects South Korea and the region, but also how it affects politics in South Korea, and how we will certainly hear a bit more about how it may have driven the decision-making on that day. I am concerned because, a lot of my work has to do with North Korea and its place in the world, and its strategy of taking a path toward becoming a nuclear power, as a way to maintain the Kim family hold on power and maintain their system. I think we don't look enough at how to stop that or how to deal with it. Excuse me, I am worried at this point, when you've got a power vacuum and so many military commanders falling, the defense minister resigning, that this could be an opportune time for North Korea to test South Korea, test the alliance. Let's hope that doesn't happen. As Professor Cho said, they're very distracted right now. They've got other things that they're focusing on, which is its relationship with Russia. I do think in some ways Kim Jong-un is also looking ahead to a potential resumption of his relationship with Donald Trump. I don't think it's going to be an easy return to that diplomacy. I think we're going to see a lot of tension in the lead up to that, so that Kim Jong-un feels that he can improve his position and improve his leverage. But I do think that's something that we have to think about down the road. So to your question about what things might be like, again, this is a time in this transition where the two governments do want to make sure that connection, the communication is strong. because I think that while the Biden administration spent a lot of time on repairing relationships that were complicated during the first Trump administration, one thing that President Yoon did was prioritize improving the relationship with Japan, which is never easy for South Korea, and really trying to establish a trilateral relationship. Will that continue into the next administration? I think that there is a lot of concern that we might go back to a kind of America First policy that could be damaging to some of those relationships in the region. And could make communication, especially when it comes to sharing information at a time of conflict, very difficult. I think that you can never predict with Donald Trump. It's a very daring thing to predict anything, because I think what we know is that he is very unpredictable. But what I will say is that I do think that he values that relationship with Kim Jong-un. But I think that Kim Jong-un's not going to make it easy for him. And I will say that negotiation is going to be even more difficult after 5 years of almost unfettered testing. And, my podcast, The Lazarus Heist, is about how North Korea has used cyber warfare, cyber attacks, cyber warfare as a form of asymmetric warfare and cyber theft, as a way to fund that nuclear program, as a way to get around the isolation, the sanctions, the border closures. And I think this is something that the North Korean, Kim Jong-un, has been investing in for many years, recognizing that when he tests, he's going to face sanctions, so he had to find a way around them. And so we've seen, as they've invested more in cyber theft, they are among the most prolific cyber actors out there today. And as we see them raise money that way and test, that means that if and when the United States, Donald Trump, does get to that negotiation table again, going to be a very, very difficult negotiation. And I'm not so sure. It's not clear to me that President Trump is going to want to go down that path so easily. It was tough enough the first time, and it didn't work out the first time. So I think it's going to be rocky. I think it's going to be rocky for some time ahead. But it'll certainly be interesting to see what happens with Russia, and how that conflict plays out. And I would also say that with North Korea, once that conflict ends, I'm not so sure that relationship is going to continue at the same level that we're seeing now. That's a very transactional relationship, and many factors could change, I think, in the months to come.
Thank you for that analysis.
Was there another aspect of your question that I forgot? Was there a question that I forgot to answer?
No, I think you covered it. Professor Cho, yes, please jump in.
And Professor Cho wants to jump in.
I do, actually, because Jane, what you said was very intriguing, and I wanted to ask you, given your on the ground experience in Pyongyang, and how you have really sort of looked into the country for such a long time and closely from many different aspects. Do you really believe that North Korea is looking for opportunity to essentially carry out potentially an aggressive act on South, if given the chance?
So I would say provocation. So always that kind of needling or pushing things right up to the edge as a way to test. But and we've seen them do that from time to time. It's always very strategic, right? Some of the skirmishes in contested waters, for example, like the sinking of the Cheonan the Cheonan warship, and the firing on the frontline islands. So I think that we see those times where they push it just up to an edge. But in terms of, say, an all-out attack, for example, I don't think that they would plan to launch a nuclear attack. That would be suicide. However, I think that the question of whether to acknowledge North Korea as a nuclear power is something that we've been discussing for a long time. But I also wonder whether South Koreans, and this might be a question for you, could accept and live with that threat for the rest of your lives. Because I do worry that if we were to acknowledge accept North Korea as a nuclear power and come to a negotiation where they're allowed to hold on to their nuclear weapons, that would mean that you would have to live with that threat. It would be a constant source of blackmail that the North Koreans would be able to use whenever they felt that they weren't getting what they needed. So, I mean, I do think that Kim Jong-un wants to hold on to those weapons and might be willing to negotiate parts of the program, but is unwilling to give up the nuclear weapons themselves. But no, to your question about an aggression, I think a provocation is how I would phrase it.
Right.
Potential for provocation, and then we have to worry about miscalculation, right? A response, either no response or a response that could trigger a broader conflict. And that's what I worry about right now when there's not enough communication. A lapse of communication and coordination is, how do you react to a provocation?
Yeah. So,
but I'm curious
the question is also, with regard to North Korea, one of the questions is always, do they have ambitions to expand? Do they want to complete what they couldn't do back in 1950? Or are they simply wanting to ensure their own survival? But, the two might merge together. But we don't think that's the case. We don't think that North Korea is necessarily looking to invade South Korea, because this is such a classic example of mutually assured destruction. If North ever makes such aggressive move, Seoul might become ground zero, but North Korea basically will not exist anymore within 2 or 3 days. Even without nuclear weapons, I think South Korea, I believe, it had, in terms of conventional weapons and military might, it ranks something like 6th in the world. So only sort of next to U.S., America, Russia, a couple of other states, and then comes South Korea. So we know that it really is a case of MAD. So and I think that's how we are able to basically carry on because people are continually asking me, how is it possible that you have this nuclear state to the north, like literally 30 kilometers from where you live, and you are able to carry on ordinary activities, and it's the belief that, well, we hope that they won't be acting irrationally, and the recent examples actually have shown that they are not irrational actors, at least. In terms of nuclear weapons issue, there is certainly a call on the part of many people in South Korea to say that, well, it's time we own nuclear weapons as well. But I think this is really a pathway to madness, and we should never acknowledge that North Korea is a nuclear state, because it is done illegitimately. It will simply give legitimacy to what should never have been done in the first place. We will make it much more difficult to impose sanctions on them. And we are not going to be more safe, I don't believe, by us, South Korea, acquiring nuclear weapons. And in fact, if such weapons had any kind of value at all, it would only be as a kind of a bargaining chip in getting North Korea to disarm as well. So we'd be basically spending huge amounts of money to build something just so that we can dismantle it. And I think there would be better ways to achieve the outcome that we are after.
These are the best
I
kind of
agree with you
conversations
completely.
that we hope when questions that I had on my list, you have already covered, because you've engaged in this conversation. And just for our audience, I want to let them know that early in the new year, we'll be hosting George Perkovich from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, who will be talking about the issue of nuclear proliferation, not just in the Koreas, but also in the broader Pacific Rim. And that's an issue which obviously we're going to be following very closely. We've reached time on this on this recording. I want to be mindful of your time, but I'd like to, before we end, I'd like to return to sort of the more hopeful and optimistic aspects of this issue that we heard at the very beginning. And so, from each of you, in your closing remarks, I wonder if you could comment on what you see as being the long-term significance of the events of the past couple of weeks. You know, is this a rebirth of democracy? Is it just the reaffirmation of democratic principles and their embedding in Korean society? Let me turn to you first, Professor Cho, and then I'll let Jean have the last word.
I really actually wanted to talk about resilience of democratic institutions, because I think that's what we witnessed on that night of 3rd of December, when the National Assembly actually managed to pass the resolution to revoke martial law. And, you know, the president was supposed to accept it immediately. It took another 4 hours to come on television and say, okay, we are going to accept, but we can't, the cabinet is having difficulty meeting, and so let me have some more time. And eventually, around 6:30, he finally declared, okay, martial law is over. But as Jim mentioned earlier, South Korea is a very young democracy. You know, it became independent in 1949 after Japan lost the Second World War, and we had 3 years of American military government rule. And 1949 is when the republic was finally declared. But we didn't really have democratic rule until really, I wouldn't even say 1987, because that was continuation of the previous authoritarian government of Chun Doo-hwan with his crony Roh Tae-woo. I would say it's really from 1993 with Kim Young-sam, and when he broke up Hanawhe, the military association that was responsible for the coup that made Chun Doo-hwan the president back then. So it's what, some 30 years, 31, 32 years that we've had history of democracy. And I kept comparing in my mind what was different this time compared to what happened in Gwangju or in the previous cases, particularly in Gwangju, because back in 1980, South Korea had never experienced a peaceful transfer of power. If you looked at all the previous presidents, one went into exile, one was assassinated, and yeah, basically that was it. So it was all kind of transferred through might, and since then we've had the democratic institutions becoming stronger. Laws were actually being enforced and being effective, and people were changing their attitudes, and they were being educated and learning how to be democratic citizens. And we often say that we've got, you know, at least 3 generations living in the same place, but in different countries, because my parents' generation and even my grandparents, they were living in basically a least developed country without democratic institutions, under authoritarian rule. And then we have my generation, who were basically living in this sort of developing nation, developing state, rapid economic development, but where the social norms and values are lagging behind. And now the millennials and the Z generation, they are living in an advanced state where they were taking these democratic institutions for granted. And so when these tests of resilience and stress testing of democratic institutions, I was really so relieved and so happy to see that we passed the test. And you also mentioned how democratic institutions are so fragile, and we so often look to America as a model of democracy and all of that. And then we saw Trump in power, and we saw January 6th. I've heard some U.S. commentators calling what happened on 3rd of December in South Korea, reverse January 6th, when citizens actually went to the National Assembly to uphold rule of law. And also looking at the way protests actually occurred, basically criticizing the way that the Conservative Party, I really cannot dignify them by calling them the Conservative Party, the People Power Party, PPP, to which the president belongs. The fact that 18 of their lawmakers actually resolved to revoke national martial law, and yet none of them attended the vote to pass the motion to impeach Yoon, who undermined the fundamental constitutional order. He really literally tried to destroy National Assembly. And so that was really disappointing. And I wanted to go back briefly to what Jean mentioned earlier, which is this polarized politics in South Korea. We often hear that, and I know that that's also the case in the US and in many other countries. But I think that in the case of South Korea, it's actually more amplified and more exaggerated by the media than is really the case. The PPP has become now just a regional party, really focused in one particular region in the world, in South Korea. And this is the kind of like place where if you put clothes on a monkey and put that Simeon up as a candidate for PPP, people would still vote for it because they are it's a PPP member. And so I think it's quite likely that once things are normalized and a new government is voted in, the justice minister will probably move a motion to dissolve that political party, I believe. And sorry, just two more things. So one is around the same time, we saw in Syria that rebel forces have ousted Bashar al-Assad, who has gone into exile in Russia. And the Assad family had ruled Syria for 50 years. And I still remember when this al-Assad actually came into power some 13 years ago. And people are talking about how he was educated and in England and trained as an eye specialist. He's an ophthalmologist by training. And they were saying that, oh, I think he will be a different kind of ruler. And yet he gassed his own people. He used biological weapons on his own people. He locked up, tortured, arrested many of his own citizens. I actually went and looked up the Syrian constitution, and it's got much of the same provisions that we have in our constitution. And I was wondering to myself, so what is different between Syria and South Korea? How did South Korea manage to sort of, develop these democratic institutions and the constitution so that they are not just paper laws and paper institutions, but actual living, working, breathing institutions that are in fact being enforced by the people power? And why was it not possible in Syria? Is it really blood, and sweat and tears that people have spilled? And also, a couple of days after the martial law declaration, Hongik, the writer, received the Nobel Prize, and she made this acceptance speech. And in it, she talked about how she had a lot of difficulty writing that book on Gwangju. And she was thinking, how can the living help the dead? Is it actually possible? And then she said, she realized that she was asking the wrong question. She realized that maybe it's the dead that's helping the living. And that's exactly how I felt when I was out there in front of National Assembly on that night. Because how were these people able to just immediately spring to action and go to the National Assembly when they knew that they could be arrested, they could be beaten up, they could be detained, they could be even tortured? And it was really, I think, the dead helping the living. It was the memory, the lived experiences the actual history that we have been through that was helping us to act and to actually enforce and realize the democratic institutions. And it's a practice that we have to engage in every day as citizens. That's how I felt.
It's a highly poignant.
And I think it's become, I would say that democracy may be a bit more precious to the South Koreans because they've been through so much in such a short period of time. And actually, I think as Americans, my American friends and I were talking about that as well. Like, what lessons can we learn? Have we taken democracy for granted? Did we go into the streets after January 6th? Do we also need to take some cues from, by the way, I don't know if you've seen the protests, the South Koreans are always incredibly innovative. I was watching a video of how people who can't make it to the National Assembly, right, to Yoido, are just sending in money to buy coffees at the coffee shops all around. South Korea has 1 million coffee shops, so that the protesters can go warm up, because it is freezing cold in South Korea right now. But every way, that sense of community is just so interesting to me. It's been really heartwarming to see, in addition to the fact that people are sacrificing their time and their well-being to go into the streets. So a lot to learn in this moment, I think, about democracy and about South Korean history.
Poignant.
May I speak in just one little comment, because I did actually want to comment about the protests and how it's kind of morphed into different shape. This set of protests are even different to the candlelight protests back in 2016 that brought down Park Geun-hye, the former president. Because this time, it's really the young people in their 20s and early 30s who are the majority of the protesters. And they bring out their light sticks that they use at these K-pop idol concerts. Absolutely. And, some people are actually criticizing, saying, how can you bring that kind of thing to this sort of serious protest? And one answer by a young girl just stuck with me. She said, I am bringing the most precious light in my life to this, because these light sticks are used to cheer on their favorite, band or idol group. And these are like die-hard fan club members. And when these light sticks are not being used at concerts, they are carefully wrapped up and, treasured at home, and they're bringing these out. And the flags that they make, it's so witty. There are things like the dog paw smell association, the never want to get out of bed association, these kind of things. And so in the past, we've had certainly a tradition and history of active democratic protests and demonstrations, but these were all very incredibly serious and somewhat rigid. And even with it in the democratic movement, it was actually very patriarchal and hierarchical. But in this new set of protests, I really saw that it was really individualistic and diverse, and yet together. And so
Expressive.
I really, felt real hope.
Well, it's not K-pop, but one of my favorite bands from my childhood was the Smiths. And to quote directly from them, there is a light that will never go out. And that's what we hope we're seeing in terms of Korean democracy. Thank you both so much for being with us today. Thank you for sharing your insights, your experience, your analysis of the situation. Obviously, Professor Cho, your firsthand experience there. This has been an extraordinary privilege for us to host you both. And we hope that we can check in with you again as we move into 2025 and we see how the situation unfolds. Obviously, this is a rapidly moving situation. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your wisdom today. And to our audience out there, thank you for watching this recording of this interview with two incredible experts. Please stay tuned for more programming from the Pacific Council on U.S. relations with the Pacific Rim and with the world in general. And for those of you who are watching, happy holidays, and we'll see you in 2025. Many thanks.